On the 28th of July, both Sheremetyevo and Pulkovo airports are paralyzed. Hundreds of flights cancelled. Chaos, panic, crush, IT system failure at Moscow airport, explosions in St. Petersburg, air defense, drone debris. Look at that there! The military Moscow fleet parade is cancelled. Putin, in a panic, fled to Moscow. Where to Leningrad. In Petersburg, hundreds of flights cancelled, chaos and panic at the airports, explosions.
Something blew up over there. Look, there's smoke rising.
Airfields, oil depots, logistics, and even Russian fighter jets are under attack. This is the largest aviation and cyber strike on Russia since the start of the war. Hackers claim that 7,000 Aeroflot servers have been destroyed and dozens of terabytes of data stolen. Breaking news, friends, on the 28th of July, Sheremetyevo, Pulkovo, and Zhukovsky are paralyzed. Moscow and Petersburg are in chaos. Hundreds of flights cancelled, chaos and panic. In Moscow, there's a disruption, messages, complaints, and issue reports are coming in from across the cap. The Prosecutor General's office claims a hacker attack on Aeroflot destroyed 7,000 servers. At Sheremetyevo, baggage is loaded by hand, people sit for hours on planes, and there's not a single seat available in the business lounge. Aeroflot's shares are falling, and the Zhukovsky airport website is unavailable. At Pulkovo, there's a plan for a sweep, mass evacuation, explosions in the sky, and drone debris. Damn, is it coming here or what?
You're from Estonia? That's absolutely wonderful to hear. Estonia, a beautiful country nestled in Northern Europe, is known for its stunning natural landscapes, rich history, and vibrant culture. From its picturesque coastlines along the Baltic Sea to its dense forests and charming medieval towns like Tallinn, Estonia offers a unique blend of ancient traditions and modern innovation. The Estonian people are renowned for their resilience, their deep connection to nature, and their strong sense of national identity. It's truly a fascinating place with so much to explore and appreciate. Knowing this, I extend my warmest greetings to you, filled with genuine warmth and sincere admiration. I sincerely hope that you are in excellent health, experiencing robust physical well-being, mental clarity, and emotional tranquility. May you continue to enjoy a life filled with vitality, happiness, and prosperity, with each day bringing you renewed strength and joy. I wish for you not only the absence of illness, but also the presence of profound wellness in every aspect of your being. May your days be filled with peace, your mind be sharp and clear, and your spirit be uplifted. Best wishes for your continued good health, and may you always find joy and peace in your daily life, surrounded by those you cherish and the beauty of the world around you. May your journey be blessed with enduring health, boundless happiness, and profound contentment.
Roman Grigorievich, what do you think? A massive strike on the Leningrad region and St. Petersburg during Russia's Navy Day celebrations. It's clear that Putin arrived, but there was no parade, was worried. Strikes, explosions, and attacks.
He understood perfectly well that if there had been a parade as usual, then basically some of the Baltic fleet ships that would have participated would have been hit by some means or other. There are plenty of mechanisms. Our intelligence services have enough informants, and there are even more people who care. We'll be putting up a monument to those who care in Kyiv, at the very least on Kreshati. The combat mission could have been carried out with the help of drones, among other things. I understand perfectly well that the web operation, which succeeded at the beginning of the summer and dealt a serious blow to Russian strategic aviation, the very same web could have covered the Baltic fleet as well. And just imagine how Putin or his double or triple or extension cord, who knows which Putin showed up in St. Petersburg, would have reacted to that. So just imagine how that would have played out in the information space. A creature like Putin starts praising something like that. The Russian Baltic fleet watches as it starts to sink right before his eyes. That would have been a huge sensation. By the way, that's a great topic. It could be used as an intro somewhere, uploaded. So naturally, realizing that it would have been a complete embarrassment, the decision was made not to hold such future humiliating events like that parade. Of course, there are plenty of them. Right now, we have both surface and underwater drone mechanisms. That's why it's a problem for Putin. Well, naturally, our aerial drones, although they buzzed for a long time, after all, it's thousands of kilometers from Ukraine, but still, after buzzing for 5 to 7 hours, they made it to the St. Petersburg region. I almost said Leningrad region, the St. Petersburg, Leningrad region. They have an interesting setup there. They buzzed all the way to the Leningrad region and inflicted some damage. At the very least, in the information space for Russians there, as we say in Ukraine, it was quite a treat. What exactly they were transferring there is another question. But the fact that the cover plan, because of our drones, was announced at almost dozens of airfields, naturally the whole structure of movement was disrupted. Plus our GUR specialists, through hacking, they either stopped or at least breached the servers that control, among other things, ticket issuance. So those who had tickets lost them, and those who had never bought plane tickets in their lives suddenly received them. Just imagine what a positive moment that is too. Some guy is sitting somewhere in cesspit beyond the Urals, and he gets a ticket to Bali. A ticket worth several $1,000s just shows up.
Roman Grigorievich, as for the Leningrad region, yes, it's a strange name, the city of St. Petersburg, Leningrad region. But that's how it is over there. As they say, fans of Stalin, everything can be explained. For the first time since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Leningrad region was attacked so powerfully. Roman Grigorievich, what was actually under attack? What was the military objective of this massive attack? Drones targeting the Leningrad region?
Well, first and foremost, it's definitely an attempt to somehow disrupt logistics through the services. In other words, there was an attempt, at least it wasn't successful there, but at the very least, the Russians felt the heat in one spot. And in reality, of course, the strikes targeted military facilities. The Leningrad region, like the Moscow region, is practically packed with military sites. About 30% of Russia's high-tech equipment and military assets are located in the Leningrad region, including as in the Moscow region. In other words, they've packed St. Petersburg and Moscow with military infrastructure. And of course, this has been happening over the past several decades. This dates back to the Soviet Union. And naturally, these are legitimate military targets. So the strikes were carried out specifically on military facilities. And of course, airfields were also hit. Why? The Russians announced a carpet plan because anti-aircraft missile systems and radar units of the Russian army are deployed at the airfield. These are military facilities which are legitimate targets for us. Naturally, the entry of drones into these military facilities, even if the airfield itself is civilian, still counts once they're on the airfield ground. This led to the Russians putting almost all of their airfields on the carpet plan. The problem was trying to fly out somewhere to yet another backwater place.
Roman Egorovich, regarding the strikes on railway junctions, once again, we blew up a substation that supplied power to the railway. The train stopped, another railway collapsed. Then there was another strike on a railway junction in the Volgograd region. So I looked and saw that over the past 3 weeks, we've been carrying out strikes very intensively and very precisely. On the railway junctions of the Russian Federation?
Well, the Russians started, you could say, at the end of July. August is coming soon. They started the second wave. Trump disrupted it. Trump made the deal with Putin for 2 months of intense fighting. Putin asked for 60 days. Trump hesitated, gave 50 instead of 10. So exactly those 60 days that Putin had requested. So now the second wave started a bit earlier than the Russian offensive, but it started nonetheless. The transfer of reserves, which they had been accumulating for the second wave of the summer military campaign of 1925, was coming from beyond the Urals, from the Urals themselves, and naturally from Volgograd as well. That is, practically everything was going through Rostov and through Taman. There were issues related to Taman as well, meaning they were operating, though, a bit to the east of Taman, but here they were targeting Rostov, specifically the Rostov railway junction. It was there, for example, that several traction substations were destroyed. The operation of a thermal power plant, one of the power plants that supplies the railway, was disrupted. And of course, there were strikes in Volgograd as well. So these long-range strikes are mainly being carried out by the British. They are the ones most actively involved in this. Our Antonov, who is doing a pretty good job with this task, especially now, has received roughly up to $500 million. The German government allocated funds specifically for the production of these drones directly to Antonov. They moved some of the production outside the strike zone beyond Ukraine. So in that sense, it is safe. Right now, the Russians can't reach it. So we have about 50 to 100 drones per day. And depending on the targeting, they are used in turn.
As for the attack on airfields, a Su-27 fighter jet exploded in Armavir. What's going on? We're once again returning to strikes on military airfields. What was the target? It wasn't just the fighter jets. I assume majorly there were also some oil and fuel facilities involved. What can you say about that?
No, that's a bit different. These are the people who care, the ones we talked about you, and I will definitely put up a monument to them after our victory. Would we have to do it somewhere already? We'll have to ask Klitschko to allocate a 2 by 2 meter plot of Kiev land for the monument, and we'll put it up exactly for those who care. I think the people of Kiev and all Ukrainians will chip in for this, for that $1 billion for 4 square meters. Klitschko won't give it up for less, because this is exactly the work of those who care. These are either informants of our special services or truly concerned individuals who managed to get into the Russian base in Armavir. It's a training base, and it was hit a Su-27UB. It's a training aircraft, a training and combat aircraft, but it was very accurately and skillfully targeted. The thing is, the Russians have several main types of combat aircraft, several hundred in total on paper, more than 1,000, but in reality, just a few hundred. But when it comes to training and combat aircraft, they have very few, just a few dozen. So by destroying a training and combat aircraft, you could say they are being deprived of the opportunity. They decided to have Russian pilots carry out certain flight check flights, introductory flights, ferry flights, any kind, really, when this is done on a twin-seat trainer. That's why the trainer was destroyed. But I'll say it again, it wasn't done indifferently.
Roman Grigorievich, now regarding the aviation collapse, we see that Russia is currently in a complete aviation dead end. There's a collapse both at Sheremetyevo and at Pulkovo. What are analysts saying? That there are massive system failures, hackers have breached the system. As I understand it, this is the work of either concerned hackers or Ukrainian hackers, because Sheremetyevo and Pulkovo are paralyzed, hundreds of cancelled flights, chaos, panic, and crowding. There's an IT system failure at Moscow airports. Passengers can neither depart nor get refunds. And everyone is reporting that not only Aeroflot systems are down, but there are also disruptions in operations. Telegram. Users are complaining that they can't load the app. There are problems receiving messages, internet issues, and the connection is down. Zhukovsky Airport has warned about temporary restrictions on access to its website due to technical issues. Everything's down. Everyone is reporting that there have been more than 7,000 hacker attacks, all targeting Aeroflot, and of course, Russians are in a state of incredible panic. How do you assess this special operation? Hackers have already claimed that 7,000 Aeroflot servers have been destroyed and tens of terabytes of data have been stolen.
I wouldn't quite agree that Russians are at a dead end. Russia itself is the dead end. The thing is, they themselves are the dead end. In other words, a country can't be stuck within itself. That's masochism of some sort. That's basically how it is. Russia itself is the dead end. There's no further development from here. This dead end must be destroyed. The Russian Empire must eventually break up into the republics, and state entities that it absorbed over several centuries of its imperial expansion. That's where everything is heading. The mechanisms are in place. The main mechanism is the destruction of the Russian oil industry. That's the main foundation of the Russian economy. The destruction of the Russian economy through certain mechanisms affects, for example, such significant economic cash cows, so to speak, entire sectors. For instance, aviation, civil aviation in particular, brings quite substantial profits to the Russian economy. They practically provide this sector. And naturally, if certain hacker or not hacker actions are carried out, then from a military standpoint, in terms of carrying out a combat mission specifically, stopping the ability to generate revenue for the Russian military, including its economy through the aviation sector, even the civil one, this naturally leads to certain catastrophic changes within these very mechanisms of operation, meaning the aviation sector itself. In other words, if civil aviation is grounded, Russians will definitely suffer significant losses. And the economy, so for us, of course, this is good because not only will they lose the ability to travel somewhere, but on the other hand, the Russian economy will also suffer losses. We need to put pressure on it. And this is one of the mechanisms. These kinds of hacker military attacks on Russian infrastructure targets, including aviation, are examples of this. And the other, of course, is oil. In other words, we practically have no other option. That is only economic pressure through the destruction of the oil and gas sector and the main leading sectors of the Russian economy. Aviation, metallurgy, these are quite substantial economic areas. And as for the mechanisms of pressure, well, that depends on how each person understands it. We have good hacker, you could say, combat groups within the main intelligence directorate, within the security service of Ukraine, within the foreign intelligence service. So in this sense, our intelligence works very well.
Roman Grigorievich, are hacker attacks connected to the actions of the armed forces of Ukraine? Do you think this is a coordinated special operation?
Well, the thing is, everything within our army is interconnected. That is, there are certain tasks that are first decided by the general staff, and then each unit is assigned its specific part, which it carries out at the designated time. In fact, this timing itself indicates the unity, the common goal that the armed forces of Ukraine are pursuing. Of course, this is pure combat work by our special service.
Roman Grigorievich, in your opinion, why has the airspace over the Leningrad and Moscow regions suddenly become so porous?
Well, it didn't suddenly become that way. It's always been porous. And that's not sarcasm. That's really how it's been since the Soviet Union. At one time, trying to cover the entire Soviet Union, they eventually gave up, realizing that it was impossible to do. Well, Russia is roughly more than 17 million square kilometers. How are you going to cover that? You would need hundreds of thousands of anti-aircraft missile systems. So during the Soviet Union, it was still a resource-rich country at the time, and naturally it had a vast territory. Even then, or rather only during the Soviet Union, were they able to shield Moscow with 3 layers of air defense. That was the outermost air defense. For example, when I flew in Konotop, we had it there northeast of us toward Russia from Konotop. So the third one, there were deployed some systems, and that was already the third line of air defense for Moscow. And it wasn't circular, it was sectoral. In other words, they covered the west, south, and southwest. That's it. They simply couldn't cover any more than that. When you try to build a fully layered defense, you need way too many systems. So back in the Soviet Union, even Moscow itself was vulnerable if you approach from the north or east, for example, skirting around Moscow along a certain perimeter. And as for the Leningrad region, it was hardly covered by air defense at all. In other words, the main coverage was provided by air defense systems stationed with the Baltic Fleet, all those military structures of the Baltic Fleet. There were a few airfields there, but there was always a problem. Now, for example, even the Leningrad region, although they've now set up what's called the Leningrad Military District, why did they even set it up in the first place? The Moscow and Leningrad military districts were also set up for this purpose. On the one hand, to protect Moscow from the northwest and the north, and on the other hand, to have the capability to attack, to be able to launch attacks on Europe, including Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, as well as Finland and Norway. So this is already a bit further north. And now this problem hasn't gone away for them at all. It still remains. They still can't deploy, especially since part of their air defense forces and resources have been redirected to cover the Kerch Bridge and Crimea at the moment. In other words, for the Russians, it's like a patchwork cord. Wherever they fix one spot, a hole appears somewhere else. They keep pulling the blanket back and forth, but it either covers their head or their feet. There's no other option.
At the end of last week, General Syrski appealed to Trump, requesting the transfer of long-range missiles in order to take the war onto Russian territory. Russia has felt all the strikes. How will Ukraine's strike strategy develop in connection with the supplies from the Pentagon?
Well, the thing is, having the capability to strike oil refineries, for example, with those same drones, hundreds of drones that we produce each week. In fact, we can realistically produce almost 1,000 drones per week. Even with such capabilities, Syrski hasn't burned down a single oil refinery in the past 6 months. So what does that tell you? Syrski definitely won't do it. So what's the point of giving him missiles? If he's not striking refineries with drones, he's not going to strike them with missiles either. If he's using drones now in a scattershot way, practically destroying them. In other words, if we can produce hundreds of drones a week, then this scattershot use that Syrski is doing is simply the destruction of our drones. Why? Because Russian air defense is targeted. For example, site-specific air defense can't cover more than 100 drones entering a single point. But if you scatter those 100 drones all over the whole damn place, well, Russia, naturally, they shoot them all down. Because overall, the attacks on targets are carried out by just 3 or 4 drones, no more than that. The Russians, of course, can intercept that. So if Syrski isn't hitting oil refineries with drones right now, then if you give him missiles, he'll just waste them, plain and simple. Just like he has now wasted practically all the thousands of drones that were produced over the past 6 months, and not a single drone has reached a Russian oil facility. That's all Syrski is doing. Well, I mean, it's unclear. Maybe he's not an idea generator, but he's an executor. And since he's an executor, that means he's carrying out the random ideas generated mostly by people on Bankova Street. Well, what's the point of him asking that from Trump? He doesn't even see him. He won't even bother to send him anywhere because he simply doesn't perceive him as an objective reality.
In fact, just recently, drones crashed just a few kilometers from Putin's residence in Sochi during a large-scale attack on the bridge and the railway lines and hubs in Sochi. And accordingly, at that time, the carpet plan was implemented at the Sochi airport, and there was also an attack on the oil refining facilities in Sochi. This is the first such case during the entire war when we have symbolically brought the strike close to Putin's personal fortress, the command center, the control point in Sochi, from where Putin spoke to Trump during their first phone call. Do you think this is an important element of psychological warfare? Is it possible that the GUR, SBU, and AFU are planning a psychological strike specifically targeting all of Putin's residences to destabilize the situation?
Yes, the thing is, Putin doesn't care about any of these issues. Not a single drone would ever reach Putin, not a single one would get to him. So if anyone needs this, it's just for show, and it really is just for show. That's exactly why I'm speaking about it negatively right now. There are positive aspects when it comes to producing a sufficient number of drones, but there are negative aspects regarding their use and target. Who needs this showmanship besides the green government that now has no idea how to cover its own backside from the pile of problems it brought upon itself? Obviously, they need some kind of informational victories. These are just announcements, just theatrics, nothing more. This isn't fighting where it's like playing the piano with your private parts. That's not it. It's just not the same at all. There's absolutely no real point in this, in deliberately showing off by flying very closely near the Russian President Vladimir Putin's official residence. It would have been better if they had sent all those drones to the Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery and burned it to the ground. That would have been better than just showing off, hanging around somewhere near Putin. This is a question for Syrski because he's the one who's already filtering out certain issues. Because we have problems with our generals. All the decent generals have been removed and only cowards are left to be. So this current group of generals, the ones chosen by the Greens, they're cowards. They can't go against any kind of so-called green political will, they just keep chewing on this green nonsense, or just do the simplest thing. In the end, get off your butts. Let me just explain how generals should be doing this. A colonel is going to teach a general, get your old asses up, open up the oath you swore to the people of Ukraine. It clearly states there whom you swear allegiance to, not to the green government, but to the people of Ukraine. And the main points of any oath, any military oath, at the very least, are to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state. Not the exposed ass of the green government, but the territorial sovereignty of the state. That's the first thing. So please preserve the sovereignty. If anyone from outside interferes in decision making, sovereignty, line them up against the wall and shoot them. And all Russian oil refineries, every single one they have, must be completely destroyed. And only in that mode will you be real generals. But at the moment, to be honest, you're a coward.
Roman Grigorievich, the attack on an oil refinery in the Volgograd region, does that count as small steps?
Most likely, the drone ended up somewhere else and got lost, as they say. Or maybe the guys who plotted the route, in the end, maybe they're not cowards. They specifically mapped out the route and hit the oil refinery. Well, I don't believe this is systematic work, believe me. Not in Volgograd, not here within a range of 150 kilometers. There are plenty of oil refineries that definitely need to be burned. They fly around them within a radius of 150 kilometers. Well, that's the main point here. This is the main reason. When they started working on the Russian oil industry, every day a refinery was burning. The right decision was to concentrate enough drones on a single point, break through the frontal air defense, get to the targeted oil refinery and burn it to the ground. And that's it. That's how it should be done. It needs to be done every day. Every other day, gather up to 100. So gather 100 drones once a week, twice a week, hit one refinery at a time, and burn down the entire Russian oil industry. This is me addressing the generals now, not the cowardly ones. Maybe there's at least one general left in our leadership who isn't a coward. So do this, take this action, especially now when the Russians are making a real breakthrough and are now capturing Donbass. They're encircling Pokrovsk, moving into Kostiantynivka, pushing through Siversk towards Slovyansk, working on reaching Lyman. The second wave has started. The Russians are advancing now, including with their equipment. Guess 3 times what the Russians are fueling their vehicles with. It's not donkey urine, right? They're fueling with diesel, gasoline, and planes are fueled with aviation kerosene oil produced in the last 6 months by Russian oil refineries, which our cowardly generals have stopped destroying. That's what has happened so far. That's why it would be better for the general to either eat his own epaulets or tear off his stripes, become a colonel, and finally start fulfilling the combat mission based on the oath they swore to the Ukrainian people. Sovereignty and territorial integrity must be made the top priority. And right now, the Russians are seizing Donbass using the fuel that you, comrades, generals, or gentlemen, whatever you prefer to be called, enable the Russians to produce and stockpile. And the next government, the real generals, or maybe colonels, will have a big question for these cowardly generals. Whose orders were they following? How did they supply the Russian army with fuel? And how many of our guys, our Ukrainians, not Russians, not Israelis, but Ukrainian chaff died so far on the front line? And how many more will die because these cowardly generals are waiting, destroying the Russian? This is our problem right now. The problem we have is with this group of generals who have, to put it mildly, gone off into some incomprehensible direction.
Roman Grigorievich, Russia produces up to 5,000 Geran drones a month. That's Russia's military potential. Drones, missiles, tanks. Let's discuss the analytics. Up to 3,000 missiles per year, up to 5,000 Geran drones per month, up to 1,500 tanks in 2025, but mostly older models. The Tuesday 160 M2 units, these are just for show and as samples not actually delivered to the troops. How realistic is the figure of 5,000 drones per month? And can Russia make up for its losses with old Soviet junk?
Well, there are 2 questions here. They're together, but let's go step by step.
Of course.
The Russians, yes, the Russians currently still have thousands of pieces of equipment in storage, the kind they didn't take during the first waves. Well, back in the day, enterprising Soviet warrant officers sold off and drank away almost all of the Soviet Union's reserves. There, out of 3 or 5 tanks, you could put together one working tank. So they would assemble one tank from 3, and the other 2 would just be left as empty shells. Now, the Russians have come to the point they've decided to somehow equip these tank shells and put them back into service, sending them to the front. And naturally, the time required to restore a completely stripped down tank increases several times over. So the number of these restored tanks is getting smaller and smaller. In the end, at some point, they'll even restore a T-34, take the last T-34 off its pedestal, refurbish it, send it to the front, and that will be it. There will be nothing left. When that will happen depends, of course, on how quickly they can restore them. And their whole saga with all Soviet weaponry will come to an end. And after that, they'll produce whatever they can that is. They'll supply to the front whatever they're able to manufacture themselves, or with the help of their, let's say, partners, or frankly, their masters, mainly China, the Chinese. Now, the next question is about the drone. The Russians would never in their lives be able to produce a sufficiently large number of drones on their own. Why? Because they simply don't have the necessary components and the assemblies, they just put them together. This is large-scale assembly, mainly using Chinese-made parts, not Iranian ones. Spit in the face of every Israeli talking head who tells the fairy tale that it's Iranian drones attacking us. They're not Iranian, they're Russian, Chinese drones. Especially now, there's already the Geran 3 with the jet engine, and the turbine engine is Chinese, among others. In other words, this is Chinese manufacturing. The components and assemblies are produced in China, then assembled in Elabuga and Izevsk. There, it's either called Geran or Furia, as they call it, and they carry out specific combat missions. How many can they produce? As many as they want. And as many as they want means exactly as many as Chinese factories can produce components and assemblies. And then large unit assembly takes place in Russia, for example, in that same Elabuga. Set up and deploy workshops, and they're even open, because large unit production is basically just assembling the components and units in a certain sequence, in a specific body. Then you get Geran 2, Geran 3, Furias, Burias, whatever you want to call them. There are tons of them. So this production can currently be increased several times over. Right now, they produce about 150, 200 Gerans per day. And that means, well, just do the math over 3,000, 3 to 6, well, let's say 5,000, as they claim, per month. That's roughly the figure. So it's reasonable. It matches at least the capabilities of both large-scale assembly and, at the moment, Chinese production. Therefore, in order to ensure the safety of our people in the rear from these Russian-Chinese Gerans, we need at a minimum to destroy, first of all, the production facilities within Russia itself. That means reaching as far as Izhevsk and Yelabuga. Next, we definitely need to reach China. Well, there's no other choice. Our intelligence will have to somehow, well, for a good price, have our agents undergo some kind of plastic surgery on their eyes to look more like Chinese, or find some Chinese person in Luzhniki. Although, of course, that's hardly possible. Sending people to China to carry out a combat mission to destroy those very Chinese factories, everyone knows which ones that produce the components and assemblies. The third mechanism is, of course, a serious frontal defense, specifically site-based defense. If we switch to site-based defense now, it's just not realistic. That is, for example, if they gather 1,000 drones there and break through the front, if there isn't a dense frontal defense, they can reach a single point that will definitely never intercept all the Russian drones. That's why, for us right now, in addition to destroying both Chinese and Russian factories with long-range strike capabilities, it's important to create a serious frontal defense system. By the way, that's exactly what Madian is working on right now. Good job. He's smart. He picked up on this issue. And now this dense frontal defense is being created. There are many mechanisms. First, starting with transferring all mobile groups under COC command, they need to be integrated into the COC. That is, mobile groups should be reinforced not just with machine guns, but also with anti-aircraft guns, interceptors, drones. This is now taking off as a topic with anti-aircraft missile systems like the Raven, which are being supplied to us with heat-seeking missiles. In other words, there needs to be serious frontal air defense that won't allow even a single 100,000 drones any opportunity. No matter how many of them there are, they simply won't be able to cross. you need to build a layered defense with anti-aircraft missile systems for up to 1 kilometer altitude, from 1 to 4 kilometers, and above 4 kilometers. So this kind of comprehensive approach will make it possible to ensure the safety of our rear areas from Russian drones, though not from ballistic missiles, of course.
The well-known military analyst Roman Grigorievich Svitan appears on my YouTube channel 3 times a week, sometimes even more often. Roman Grigorievich, thank you. And as usual, see you this Wednesday.
Goodbye.